Yes, hello once again and welcome to the 2023 Kendal Classic Revival Scramble. Yes, hello, thanks for joining me here on Classic Dirt Bike TV once again, and as you can see we're out and about once again, and we've made the journey south from Scotland to Kendal to cover the 2023 Kendal Classic Revival Scramble. Now this event is run by the Westmoreland Motor Club, who have been running motorsport events in this area of the country for many years, and this particular track here at the Westmoreland County Showground has been used a few times in the past for this particular event. Now as such I don't have any format or the names of the classes that will be racing in Sunday's race event, but there will certainly be plenty pre-1968 vintage bikes right up to those relatively modern twin shock bikes or the pre-1984s. So there's quite a lot to get through here at the Westmoreland County Showground, so without any further delay, let's take our usual walk around the paddock and take a look at some of those very nice machines that are soon to take part in this 2023 Kendal Classic Revival Scramble. So thanks for joining me once again for a walk around the racing paddock here at the Westmoreland County Showground, and we're going to start with this lovely 1965 Rickman Matisse 500 Triumph that belonged to Robin Chadwick. But this time round we're just going to take a brief look at Robin's bike, but I do intend to do a full video on this machine at a much later date, because there were just so many bikes taking part in this year's Revival Scramble event that I just struggled to actually get round most of them, because we had over 200 riders listed to take part this year, and over 50 of them were 125s. So there's plenty bikes to see from this Revival Scramble, and this is just part one of at least 3 videos from around the paddock. So I do hope you enjoy some of the machines that we're going to see in these coming videos. But anyway, back to Robin's Triumph Matisse, which as you can see is powered by a twin cylinder 500 Triumph motor, which Robin said was quite a good little power plant and was much easier to start and handle than the bigger 650 twins. And again, this Rickman chassis has an alloy bash plate fixed on to those front down tubes, just to try and help protect that precious Triumph motor from being damaged by stones and other debris that would have been thrown up from the track. But it certainly is a sweet sounding motor, this Triumph twin, and you can hear and see this bike in action on the track when we eventually get to the racing footage from this revival event. But as we move on to the front of Robin's Matisse, it's a pair of top quality REH forks, and in terms of suspension units for these old classic racers, they certainly don't come much better than these REH forks, because these are super high quality and, as you can see, superbly engineered. And again you can see that we have the traditional old school drum brakes on the front and at the rear, but we'll go into all of these parts in a lot more detail when we do a proper profile on Robin's bike later here on my channel. But it's suffice to say at this point that the bike is built from some of the very best of materials, and for me Robin's Matisse Triumph is without doubt one of the nicer examples that I've come across in quite some time. And as I just mentioned, look out for a much more detailed look at this lovely bike when we do a future video here on my channel. But as you can see, the weather at this point at Westmoreland was absolutely fantastic, but this was the Friday prior to the Sunday's race event, because most of the Saturday it absolutely peed down, but it was sufficient to wet the track and prevent the dust from flying when the bikes eventually took to the course on the Sunday. But as I said, a beautiful example of one of these iconic Rickman scramblers in Robin Chadwick's 500 Triumph, and look out for a full review of this bike coming soon to CDB TV. Now this was another classic that I managed to grab on the Friday at Westmoreland, and this stunning 1979 WR 500 CCM is yet another fantastic rebuild restoration from Jem Parker and Jai R Racing. Now, our featured Clues competition machine is not a fully 100% original example, but it still has a genuine factory CCM chassis and a 500 4-valve motor. And again, this is another bike that we're going to save so that we can do a much more in-depth look at it at a later date. So in this instance, it's really just a quick look around, as we have so many bikes to feature from around the paddock that we want to fit in as many as we possibly can. But basically, Jem's father bought this bike in 1982, and the machine had already been through 2 previous owners before that, but Jem's dad still raced this bike for just 1 season and then unfortunately hurt himself, whereby the bike was then parked up in the corner of his garage where it lay for many years, up until eventually Jem took it upon himself to do something with his dad's old bike, so he completely dismantled it and began on a full restoration of the Clues Classic. But certainly straight away you can see the quality and the workmanship on this WR Works replica chassis, and all of that fantastic chrome plating was done by S&T Plating in Bristol here in the UK. But as I mentioned, this CCM's not a fully stock example from 1979, because it does have a set of different suspension units from the CCM originals, and these are 43mm Showa suspension parts taken from a 1983 Honda, because Jem's original intention is to get a top rider to race this bike on the track, so he didn't want to go with the lesser quality CCM parts. But the bike's rear hub though is the genuine CCM magnesium part, which is very rare to see on one of these old Clues bikes. And these rear suspension units are a pair of fully adjustable YSS piggyback units, and these once more are hugely popular on these old school twin shock classics, and again much better quality than those old original items that Clues bolted onto these bikes in 1979. But as I mentioned, we're keeping all of the little intricate details of Jem's CCM bike build under wraps for the time being, until we do a full feature on this bike at a later date. But this quick introduction will hopefully whet your appetite in anticipation of a future video posting on this 1979 WR 500 CCM. Okay, so next up, it's the first of many classic 125s that we're racing at this 2023 Revival event, and this time it's the turn of Chris Winder's super slick and very quick Honda CR125, and Chris's little buzz bomb was just one of over 50 125s that were racing at this year's event. Now, I'm pretty sure that Chris told me that this was a 1980 model, and believe me when I say that this bike is as quick as it looks, and you can see Chris's bike and many more 125s like it buzzing around the racetrack when we eventually get to posting all of the racing from this event in the coming weeks. But the popularity of these 125 bikes, and these Hondas in particular, appear to be increasing year on year, and because of that the demand for bikes has certainly grown. So we are without doubt witnessing the growth of yet another classic formula with these air-cooled 125 race bikes. Now, even back in 1980, these Honda motors were still quick little power plants for their time, and this 1980 engine was changed to a centre port exhaust for this year, as opposed to what was a side port barrel on the previous year's 1979 engine, which, to be fair, was pretty dire even for a smaller 125. But for 1980, Honda certainly did their homework on this compact little two-stroke, which was reputed to knock out around the 20 horsepower mark, and as long as you kept it buzzing and on the pipe, you could be sure that it would keep you at the sharp end of the racing pack. And these motors may have been small and compact in their size, but they certainly pushed out some good power for a 125. But there were still plenty cogs to dance up and down on in that 6-speed gearbox, although the little motor's clutch did get some punishment because it was being slipped constantly to keep the engine in its sweet spot, which was usually around the mid-range. And again, as you can see, these 1980 125s were fitted with a right-sided kickstarter, which some riders found a bit strange at the time, but the grid pattern reed valve block was a brand new design for this year, and the 1979 key-in carburetor was also upgraded to a bigger 34mm unit from the previous year's 32, although it looks like Chris has swapped his key-in for what looks like an equivalent Mikuni. But moving on from the engine onto the front end of the bike, now once more I'm sure that the forks on Chris's 125 aren't from the stock 1980 machine, which I think had quite spindly 37mm Showa units for that year, but these look like they may have come from an older Honda model. But of course don't quote me on that particular fact, because I never assume to know everything about every kind of motorcycle. But more nice trick upgrades on Chris's bike here, with this alloy rear swing arm to replace what probably would have been a steel swing arm back in 1980. But as I keep saying, very few of these older twin shock 125s still have their original parts these days. But of course, Chris's 1980 machine is just one of many 125s that we're going to showcase from the Revival Scramble Paddock. So if you're into your smaller little 125 dirt racers, then you'll hopefully enjoy some of the nice examples that we're going to show you in the coming episodes. So there you have it. That's Chris Winder's 1980 125 Honda Elsinore. Next up, it's another nice little 250 Honda this time, an example of one of those iconic 1974 250 Elsinores, but actually the rider's name wasn't listed in the race programme, unfortunately, but obviously his or her name is Bryce, going by the name that's posted on the bike's side panel. But once more, not of course an original LC because of its different rear suspension and alloy swing arm and those top and bottom triple clamps as well, but nonetheless another cracking example of what was said to be Honda's first ever purpose-built 250 two-stroke motocross machine. And as you can see on the back there, a nice pair of classic Maxton shocks on the back of the bike to replace what probably would have been a pair of Honda originals. Now both the front and the rear wheels are once more a pair of nice gold anodised XL alloy wheels. Thankfully this time not in black, as many riders now appear to be fitting to these old classic bikes. But what an absolute belter of a motor these 250 Elsinore engines are. Tough as old boots and very reliable, but as I remember, I'm pretty sure these had a 5-speed close ratio gearbox and a wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch. Now on our Bryce bike here, you can see that somebody's machined a brand new alloy side casing out of what looks like a single block of billet alloy, but certainly a beautiful piece of CNC milling, which was all done probably because the owner couldn't find an original Honda replacement. But as you can see, the workmanship and the engineering in this part is top class and so much better than the Honda original. Now once again, I'm not entirely sure if these are the original forks on this bike, as they certainly look much beefier than the stock LC forks from 1974. But then again, riders did tend to fit these kind of upgrades onto these smaller two-strokers to make them handle just that little bit better when they were on the track. But quite small hubs for a 250 dirt bike, but then again I'm sure the overall dry weight of these LCs was only around the 200 pound mark, so it certainly wasn't a heavy bike to have to bring to a sudden stop. And we take another view there of those good quality Maxton rear shocks, all made of course right here in the UK at Frodsham in Cheshire, who actually are another good supplier to consider if you're needing suspensions for your old classic bike. And once more, and as in Chris Winder's bike, a replacement alloy swing arm for what would have been a steel item from back in the day. And in this shot here, your instantly recognisable shaped and painted Elsinore fuel tank in alloy, of course. And we also have that original plastic CR mudguard extension here as well at the front. But as I said, a very nice example of a 1974 250 Elsinore and Honda's first ever proper purpose-built scrambles race bike, which is actually even more amazing when you consider that in the very early days of the Honda empire, Soichiro Honda stated to the world that they would never ever build a two-stroke motorcycle, and eventually they went on to give us some of the most iconic two-stroke dirt bikes in the history of the sport. Okay, moving on to our next pair of Paddock bikes, and these nice couple of Suzuki twin shockers belong to Tony Travis from St Helens. Now, one of these bikes is a 1980, while the other is from 1978. But again, it's great to see these old RMs still taking to the track and not locked away in some dusty private motorcycle collection. But without doubt, a nicely sculpted alloy fuel tank on this 1980 bike to replace what probably would have been the original plastic item, and again the tried and tested RM 250 air-cooled motor, which, as you're aware, was the very last of the air-cooled RM Suzukis, because Suzuki then went into liquid cooling and a single rear monoshock suspension system when they launched their brand new RM 125 in 1981. But you certainly don't see many of these older twin shock RMs take to the track these days, especially in the vintage classes. But as you can see, a nice pair of Falcon piggyback shocks on Tony's 1980 RM, which I know are quite decent units, because I did have a similar pair of these on my old 1980 440 Michael that I used to race back in the day. But another strong looking rear swing arm on our 1980 bike, which certainly looks correct for its year, although it looks like this one's been painted gold at one time, as I'm sure that the stock originals were left just as bare metal. Although it certainly wasn't so easy to get a good look at Tony's RMs, because they were a bit tightly packed together, but nevertheless we tried our very best to get the cameras into some of their nooks and crannies just to get a few decent shots. But original or not, this 1980 is still a lovely looking machine. But from Tony's 1980 bike to this time a 1978 example, which I have to say does look in quite nice original condition, apart from maybe that DEP tailpipe and maybe different shocks, of course. But again, another iconic twin shock racer from that golden era of motocross, the late 1970s, when many still regard that time as some of the best for motocross legends and their iconic race bikes. But you can see that those original Suzuki rear shocks on Tony's 78 RM have been swapped for these classic Hagen shocks, which once again are all manufactured here in the UK. But I certainly had to do a bit of unorthodox camera work here, trying to get a quick look at that 78 RM 250 motor, which, as I recall, was quite a good little two-stroker for its time, and quite powerful as well. Although these are still a very nice pair of Suzuki twin shockers. That's Tony Travis's 1978 and 1980 RM 250 Suzukis. Okay, so next up in our paddock walkabout is a brief gander at Ian Stainton's classic Clues Stroker, which, as you're aware, were the very first motorcycles that the great Alan Clues built when he bought over the defunct BSA competition department in the early 1970s. Although some people still think that Alan Clues went straight into building his iconic CCM bikes at that time, which of course isn't exactly correct, because Alan built these Clues strokers in 1972, and he didn't actually register the Clues competition machine's trading name until he then built his first ever proper CCM model in 1973. But of course, they were all powered by this mighty BSA B50 four-stroke power plant, just like this one of Ian's here, which even for an old 1960s design was still an absolute belter of an engine. Now, Ian's particular Clues stroker isn't an authentic 1972 bike, but it's still a carbon copy of the original Clues stroker design, and the frame and swing arm and many of the bike's other parts are all manufactured by Joe Maxwell Engineering in Dumfries in Scotland. And as you can see, Joe uses CZ rear hubs on these repo stroker bikes, basically because the CCM originals are now almost impossible to find. And the bike's alloy fuel tank once again is a Joe Maxwell reproduction of the original Clues item, complete of course with its JME Clues stroker logo on the side. But the bike's frame and many of the other parts, as I said, are basically all carbon copies of the original Alan Clues chassis blueprints. But you can certainly see Ian racing this big 520cc Clues stroker on the track when you review the footage of the pre-1974 age group from 51 to 59 class. And as I mentioned, the racing footage with this bike included, you'll be able to take a look at once we've finished all of these Paddock videos. But that's Ian Stainton's Clues stroker 520. Okay, so just to conclude this part 1 clip from our travels around the Westmoreland Revival Racing Paddock, we're going to take a look at Alan Hardy's 1977 380 Czechoslovakian twin shock at CZ. Now, once again, Alan's machine is not a fully original bike from that year, so there's certainly no need to comment saying that the parts aren't correct for its year, because these days you're never going to come across one of these old Czech Republic CZs that still have all of their factory fitted parts still bolted onto them, as most riders will fit as many different parts as they can lay their hands on just to keep these bikes racing on the track. But my personal opinion is that there just seems to be too much emphasis on trying to keep bikes original these days, as I like to think that it's more important to keep these old-timers out there in the public view and on the track, rather than worrying about if your bike doesn't have the same brake or clutch lever it had 40 years ago. But for sure, Alan's 380 still has its stock CZ brakes, which, as I remember, were quite good stoppers even for a late 1970s dirt bike. And this rear brake again did quite a good job of slowing our two-stroker if you wanted to make a quick stop or maybe slow it down for a quick turn. And for sure, these CZ 380 power plants were great little motors, and with the right rider in the saddle, it's still highly competitive even against many of the big brand Japanese bikes of its day. And as you can see there, our motor has had the Peter Gerard gear shift modification done, where basically you fit these remote style linkages onto the side of the casing, which then eliminates that very long throw that's normally associated with these old CZ transmissions. And this brand new system then makes this motor shift just like, and some even say better than any Japanese equivalent machine. But when you get one of these old 380 CZ motors set up and running absolutely perfect, then as I said, they're more than a match for any other machine racing on the track. Okay, it's competition time now, and I'll give you just a few seconds to see if you can name the make and model of this fuel tank, and I'll give you a little clue. It's certainly not a CZ part item. But certainly go to the top of the class if you said that it was an EMC or EMX fuel tank, although I always thought that those were yellow plastic and not blue as shown here. But as we move on to the back end of Alan's CZ, a pair of Hagen shocks bolted on once again, and that expansion chamber is also a replacement from Gerard Copping's at CZ stuff. But overall, Alan's 380 does have some quite nice parts bolted onto it, with these quality Magura levers and their associated rubber lever covers, which all help towards keeping it in the era of 1970s twin shock racing. But we'll also be taking a look at yet another CZ race bike from Alan when we post part 2 in this series from the 2023 Revival Scramble Paddock. But certainly once more another very nice example of one of these Czechoslovakian twin shock racers, and that's just the first of 2 bikes that we will be looking at from Alan Hardy. So look out for more when we return in part 2. And so there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed this first selection of machines from around the paddock at the Revival Scramble 2023. But just to whet your appetite, these are just a few of the bikes that we'll be taking a look at when we post part 2 in the series. So for the time being, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again very soon when we return for Bikes in the Paddock, part 2.